Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 105 of the CUInsight Experience. This episode is brought to you by our friends at PSCU. We love having them as a partner and sponsor of the podcast. They help us to be able to bring this to you and have so much fun doing what we do. As the nation's premier payments CUSO, the folks at PSCU proudly support the success of more than 1,500 credit unions. My name is Randy Smith. I am one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and I'm lucky enough to have conversations with the best and the brightest from around the credit union community and bring them to you. Today, we have a very special guest that I get to pick her brain and see what nuggets we can find that we can, all learn from. My guest on today's show is India Gary Martin. India's name may be familiar to some of you. She was our keynote recently at the Lead CUInsight Mini-Con Conference series. And after that, I needed more India. So many more questions came from her keynote that I wanted to ask her, but back to her bio. We'll get to all of those here in the show. I'll let her do the talking, most of it. Back to her bio. India is a nationally acclaimed keynote speaker with more than 25 years in financial services, and she's also a member of the Forbes Coaches Council. I absolutely love this conversation. It's the type of conversation I had in mind when coming up with this crazy idea called the CUInsight Experience podcast. We talked a ton about leadership, specifically on how we can provide effective and intentional leadership to our teams that is impactful. Just so awesome. And if you attended Mini-Con, we went deeper and dug into what credit unions can do to not only stay relevant, but thrive in these times that we're living in. As always, we wrapped up the show with some rapid fire questions. Who is the person India thinks of when she hears the word success, and why? You'll have to listen to find out. She's worked with a lot of amazing leaders, so her answer may surprise you. I loved it. I didn't want this conversation to end. It was just so cool. So stay tuned also at the end of the show. In the recap, I'll share with you about our next keynote for Mini-Con that's coming up. Change. Hopefully she'll be a future guest on the podcast too. This one was so much fun. I'd love to do this again. So with that, I give you my conversation with India Gary Martin. Enjoy. India, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted and excited. I've been looking forward to this all week.
Oh, me too. I'll tell you, I was so excited to have this conversation with you. I have to be honest up front. People that listen to the podcast will know this, but when I was going through your bio, and you've lived all over the world, which means I assume you've traveled all over, and then I'm going to have to be intentional not to make this a travel podcast, but so a scratch my own itch question, and then there will be many of these. How has that global perspective helped you now that you're training leaders, on a daily basis?
It's interesting because it depends on who the leader is and what, because sometimes it's quite relevant and sometimes it's not. I think, no, that's not true. It's always relevant because I think that, we kind of have to, if we think about things like best practice and we think about the, great ways of doing things, we should be taking those examples from everywhere, not just what we know. So even if a leader has domestic or even regional or even local responsibility, still kind of being able to think about how things happen in other parts of the world and how we may be able to apply some of the better learnings to the things we do is I think, a part of that.
Over the past few years, and people have heard me mention it on the show before, I've spent time in Indonesia and in Kenya, and I was blown away working in financial services here on how far honestly advanced their payment technology was, because they'd skipped multiple steps to get to where everything was on the cell phone, right? And it was such an interesting thing to come back to and say, boy, we can really do some stuff better that many people probably would not. That's not where people think to go necessarily look for. What can we do better, right?
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of being able to enter a market without having any of the legacy kind of stuff, right? That you can kind of just step into it. And I think about but here's one that shocked me, right? I lived in the UK for I don't know, almost 20 years. And in 2005 or 2004, they were doing chip and pin. When I moved back to the US, I was appalled that they were asking for my signature in 2015 or 16. I was like, what is this? Because it's a really simple thing that prevents so much fraud.
Right, exactly.
And I was thinking like, what? And so it's really funny because when I came back from the UK and they bring me a bill in a restaurant or whatever, and I put, people put your card down. I was like, where's the machine? Where's the terminal? Because in the UK, they bring the terminal to a table. You put in your chip and pin in. I was like, I'm not giving you my card to take away to some place that I can't see it. It's those kind of things just.
Oh, absolutely. So I'd like to start with a big question. I'm sure last year you had to pivot, or into this year even, right? Like everyone else did out there. A question that's really been sticking with me, and I've started asking on the podcast this year, is this idea of, like, we all did a lot of amazing stuff. Like when we made those pivots very quickly, I saw it in credit unions where it was like, you didn't have to wait a year for the strategic plan. And then, whatever, you just did. My question to you is, how much of that, is like, okay, this is here to stay. How much of it was timely? And maybe it's time to move, and start thinking about the future and kind of take that time away from just putting out fires. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I will say that I think we've probably, from a business perspective and across most sectors, industries, have probably grown 10 years in a year. Yeah. In terms of what we thought was possible. And I think that a part of, when I think about the pivot, for me, it wasn't as difficult because I'm the queen of Zoom anyway. And so I was quite happy, and though I have to do like a lot of traveling, I was quite happy not to have to do that. So my pivot was I got to stay at home, which made me very happy because despite how I show up, I'm quite an introvert. So I was really happy to be, and I have to say that, I understand that's not for everybody, but I am one of those that's happy to be at home. But that's not the question you asked. But I will say that the pivot really is, I think that what people saw was a level of agility and resilience that they hadn't expected, and the ability for whole organizations to be agile and resilient in ways that they hadn't expected, right? So if you take working from home as an example, remote working, people were like, oh, it can't be done. They could never do that from home. We can't do it from home. And now you've gone to the other end of it where you have these major corporations who are saying we'll have one headquarters building and we're not renewing leases anywhere else. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, and what they understood is that now if you look at it in that example, people don't have the commuting time. They're doing just as much, probably more, because they're at home, and that they've been missing a trick for a long time.
That's a question that you just sparked something in my head. We all put so much effort, I think, and you heard it across the board in organizations where they were like, holy smokes, our productivity was through the roof in the beginning of this. At some point, though, we have to get back to work-life balance, work-life integration, right? Like we can't just be looking at our computers 24/7 and available 24/7. So, and it kind of led to a question that I was excited to ask you. And like, once we get past this kind of scarcity mindset and we start looking forward again, you mentioned all the change that's happened in this 1 year that would have probably taken us a decade. Any thoughts for those leaders, I guess, out there who really want to, need that time and space to think strategically? Let's just say that.
Yeah. I get it. But I think that the world, like if you're waiting for it to go back, that's the wrong mindset because it's not going back. Like it's not going back, and I think one of the things that we have to kind of, if you're waiting for the return to normal, you're waiting for the wrong thing. And you're missing a trick, frankly, because here's the thing. Instead of thinking about, how do we get back to normal? How, I need this space and time. Think about how you get more creative with your space and time. And frankly, how you allow your employees to become more creative with their space and time. If they don't have to travel, do they really have to be on between 8 and 4? Yeah. Is that when they have to do it? Right? No, it might be more flexible. It might be better for them to do it from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 10 o'clock at night. We'll let them do that. So here's the thing, is that there's a lot of opportunity in this, but it requires reframing your thinking. And if you try to go back to what it was before, you're going to be sadly mistaken because there are lots of folks who are terribly happy working from home. Lots who want to get back in for some period of time and some who, want to go back in altogether. But the reality is, there are going to be lots of organizations who are going to be offering people the ability to have that kind of flexibility. And if you're not on that wave and you haven't thought about how you're going to do that strategically for your business and how you're going to show up differently around your employees and what you provide to them because there's this opportunity now, then you're going to be behind the curve. And so you're going to be by yourself. You're going to be alone, wonder, I want to create time for myself. Well, you're not going to have to work too hard at doing that because employees are going to be looking for the flexibility that this provides. I think the shift is in understanding that the times people work may be different, not that they need to work more.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, no, that's good stuff right there. So one of the questions that I also had for you was, like, you work with people all around the globe. When you think of a good leader, like, what pops into your mind? Like, and what makes that person a strong leader?
My number one is somebody who has the ability to make a decision, right? People will forgive indecision. I mean, will forgive a wrong decision, but will not forgive indecision. And so, the ability to make a decision is number one on my list. And number two on my list is the ability to do that with kindness and empathy, right? Understanding that you're making a decision with what you know right now, and that, it may not make everybody happy, but you can do that with kindness and empathy, right?
That's so interesting what you said right there to me. I had a question in the first season of the podcast about making that difficult decision, and like, do some people just have it in them and some don't? Is it a learned trait, right? But what you just said, on the flip side of that, if you do make the bad decision, or let's not call it bad, the wrong decision, whatever you want to use, you have to be able to own that too, right? Like, I mean, that's so important, I would think, with authenticity.
But you can manage that with framing too, right? You can always go into something, and this is the thing that people miss, right? They make these decisions and carry on and try to get everybody, but they don't bring people along the journey. So before you make a decision, it's really simple to say, listen, this is the decision that I'm making with the information that I have right now. The information may change, and I may then thus need to change based upon additional data points that shift my thinking. But right now, with what I have, this is the decision. And that's really important, because then people understand, okay, so there may be things that shift or change, but if you make a decision and then change it next week, then people are like, what's happening here? Well, you got additional data points, but you didn't communicate that to people. Yeah. And I think if I think about the really strong leaders, they know how to communicate, they know how to do it with empathy, and they know how to make decisions.
Back to communication and empathy. I love it. For those who didn't have a chance to attend Lead, what are a few things that we can do every day to help us become, intentional and effective leaders? Leaders who actually, in credit unions, we talk about the impact we're able to make in our communities, but as a leader, being a leader who can actually make an impact.
Listen, because sometimes we're so busy leading, I have my air quotes going, that we're so busy leading that we forget to listen, and we miss all of the good kind of stuff that comes out from way down in our organizations. Like, we should be having the conversations with the receptionist, with the janitor. I mean, honestly, with everybody, right? So listening is a key part of that, because, and I think the other thing is, when you're thinking about how you're going to do things strategically in your organization, and you think about how that's going to impact people when you talk about implications and impact, that you think about people's experience when you're solving, and not how you support them. Because support is in the now. It's today. It's for a specific thing, and it may not be solving the problem. When you're solving for somebody's experience, you're solving for the future, because you know exactly what you do. If you think about, if they say, my experience is this, then you know what to solve for, and you're probably solving for a lot of other people too. And so it's a really important frame. Like, when you think about the kind of how you listen and what you do, it's also about thinking about what you're going to do with that information, which is either solving for support or experience. And I say solve for experience.
That's really cool. The past year, I've really been trying to work on listening better, and not what I want to say next. I will honestly admit it has been a struggle, because I was used to doing something for 45 years. But that idea of, and a trick that somebody else on the podcast gave me once was repeating what people said in your head, just so you're not constantly trying to think what you want to say. But that idea of solving for their experience, that's what they're feeling, right? So that's good stuff. I love that. Being intentional is something that, I've talked about it before. I journal about it. I talk about it with my partner, Jill. We talk about it quite a bit, actually, about just living life intentionally. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that. What does being an intentional leader look like? And if you could, why is it, so important to be intentional as a leader? And then there was something that I thought about it after, when I was putting down this question for you, but it was, what does it feel like for our team to be working for an intentional leader?
My grandfather used to say this thing, which I loved. And he used to always say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I mean, and I know that's out there, and it's been out there for a long time, but I think that kind of ties to what being intentional is about. like knowing who you are and what you stand for. So that intentionality, because when people, let me start with the team piece, right? When your team knows who you are and knows what you stand for, and with your, based upon your intention and how you show up, then they know what they're going to get, right? And when you're not intentional and you're not clear and you don't do such a great job stating your purpose and the context, which is what, for me, intention is all about context for teams and people. Like that's what it's all about. When I say that, I mean, when you can provide people context, they know exactly what to do. Again, they understand, and you're creating an environment of intention because folks know what to do when they understand the context in which you're operating and also the context of your expectations. So as a leader, being really intentional about your expectations, about the context, being intentional about how you show up is wonderful for teams because they know exactly what they need to do. Even if you're not saying it's this right here, they understand what your expectation is, the context around those expectations, what who you are, and it just helps them to march along. But when you're not intentional, and you don't spend the time doing those things, what people look for is answers from you as opposed to thinking for themselves. Because they never know, right? So they're just going to be like, well, what do you want us to do? Well, when you create an intentional environment where people understand the things I talked about, they will think for themselves. And often it kind of creates innovation. It's kind of innovation and creativity comes because they know what your intention is. They know what you expect, and they can go off and do that and kind of have ideas. But if they don't, they're kind of like, well, what would India want me to do? So I think the intention piece goes across multiple vectors.
Let me ask this, an add-on here. If there's let's just say there's a CEO of a credit union who's listening to this right now, and she or he is like, oh man, I need to do a better job of that. It doesn't seem like, even if they, as the leader, change that overnight, my guess is it's going to take a little bit of trust on the other side from the team to say, no, we do whatever they say, right? Like in that kind of structure. That just feels like something that's going to hit home with some people. Like, do you have any recommendations for that person who like sits there and listens to that and says, oh boy, I got to do a better job of like context, like you said, of being intentional with my team and allowing them that space to go do amazing stuff, right?
Yeah. Get a good coach like me. Just kidding.
There you go. Perfect. We will link to that on the show notes. So
no, I think I think that you're right. I mean, it will absolutely take people time to respond to that because it won't be something. If you haven't always done that, then it won't be something that the people expect or even understand how to deal with in the first instance, right? But I think if you think of it, if I gave you a couple of quick things that you could do, to kind of walk through that, I would say the first one is that clarity. I mean, I would say first is clarity and context. First, clarity for yourself. What is it that you want? Like that's the ultimate question. What is it that you want to achieve from this interaction? That's the first thing. Being clear about what you want makes it much easier to communicate it. And when you're still trying to figure it out yourself, it's really difficult to communicate. But we often step into spaces where we haven't thought about what we ultimately want. We know what we want for this moment, but is that actually what we ultimately want? Right? So what is it that we're really trying to achieve? And that's the first question in terms of driving, because you can be really intentional when you understand that, right? Because you know exactly what it is, but we don't spend the time to really get to the root cause of root of what we truly want. And I think if you start there, that's my first tip, right? Understand that. The second thing is being thoughtful about how you show up for people. So, example, I'll give you a great example. I was working with a leader. I was going to be doing a retreat for this CEO and their leadership team. And this leader said, I want people to show up. I want them to show up at this retreat, and I want them to not answer the way they'd expect me. They would think I'd want them to answer, right? And so I said, okay, that's great. So have you created an environment where they actually can do that? Because you tell them that, but how are you behaving and how are you showing up? If you're telling them what to do all the time, or when they bring you their thoughts, or when they actually push the boat out and you say, but that's not what I asked for, I want you to do this, then what are you getting? I mean, like, what do you want them to do? Because you can't say one thing and then behave in another.
Right.
Right. So I'd say those are my two biggies to start.
I may just be speaking from personal experience here, but one of the things that I've found, and it's interesting, you're an entrepreneur yourself, is like so often, and whether you're an entrepreneur, if you're like growing up in your career, that almost that A-type personality, that go-getter that just gets things done, there's success early for. And then at some point, as you start to lead people, you don't succeed by you getting the stuff done, right? You need the whole team. So for me, that was a big struggle not to just do things like that way. I mean, it's something that just has to be done. So I feel for that CEO that you was like, did you create the environment? Oh no. Okay. I got to change some things internally then, right? So
yeah. I mean, really, I always say to people, you have to do your work before you can do the work.
Yeah.
Right? So do your work first. And that means you need to, before you start looking to do the big, we have to do this for the team. What about you? Because what is it that you need to do differently first? And I do want to say one thing to something that you said. You said you're an entrepreneur, and actually I'm so not. I mean, I thought that I was, but I say that to say that actually I am more client driven than when I sat in an investment bank, because and so I truly am really working for those people, for these people. I might be paid differently, but I have a different view of what I think an entrepreneur really is, and I'm paid by people who really do drive my time and energy.
Right. No, that I understand. So it's you know directly who
you know who you are. If you're listening, you know who you are.
Absolutely. In credit unions, it's not tough to find purpose. Are there any tools or hacks that you have to make sure that, I guess, we're living within that purpose, whether it's, at our credit unions or whether it's personally?
Ooh, living with purpose. That's a tough one. Not really, because I think that it's something that we all have to do. I think when I think about what living with purpose means, and that's either at work or at home, it's actually, for me, does the thing that I'm doing align to my moral compass? Right? That's really what it is for me. And that's how I try to frame it for folks, because purpose is so kind of amorphous. You're kind of like, what purpose is so big.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say, I'll know I'm living with purpose when. Right? And so, I know that I'm leading with purpose when. And so I think that it really is making sure that the decisions that you make and the things that you do align to your moral compass. And I think as long as you're doing that, you're living with purpose, because you can't always, when you think about like a work environment, you don't always get to make decisions about, if you have to pay your bills, there are things you have to do. But the question is, are those things, do they align to your moral compass? Because if they do, then it's fine. Right. So that's kind of my purpose. That's how I drive purpose. And there are some leaders that I've seen who have a tremendous amount of purpose. But when I peel back the onion, it's because everything they do is aligned completely to their value system.
I love you bringing up moral compass. I think that's awesome. I was reading one of the articles when I was preparing for the show that you wrote, and I want to look down and actually read it off so I say the title right. But 7 things I've learned about leadership. I could have remembered that. And we'll link to that in the show notes. It was an interesting when I was going through it. The first one, that first number 1 bullet point, the judgment, really stuck with me. And then also, it seemed like number 6 could tie into that judgment too. Don't just listen to hear, like I said, something obviously that's top of my mind, but it made me think about a question. That idea of not passing judgment. We live in a very divided country right now. In conversations with Jill, I know when she's working with credit unions, she talks a lot about, on social media, we may be able to unfriend, but at work, there can be different people in we're not allowed to just be like, you're not allowed in the break room. So, again, a question I couldn't wait to ask you, if people that we're working with, we fundamentally agree with stuff outside of work, how do we not pass judgment? And how as a leader do you not pass judgment against, if we look at the demographics, half your team?
That's such a good question. I'll tell you when my aha moment came. I mean, in the current environment, frankly. Yeah. And my aha moment came when, because, I won't betray my political affiliation, but I'll just say that, that until 2016, I had very, 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 I could see a lot of things in both of our more significant parties that certainly fit my To say I'm a centrist, I'll say that. That's what
okay. Yeah.
I've always been, I think until then, pretty much a centrist.
Yep.
And one of the things that woke me up recently, one of the things that kind of, when I was thinking about the kind of vitriol and the divisive nature of how people are behaving, I was watching the news and my husband says, okay, this is great, but let's go watch the news on the other side. Right. And so I did. And I was like, these people are horrific. When I was watching the other side, I thought, my goodness, these people are terrible. And then I went back to what I was watching and I was like, wow, the people that I watch are doing the same thing, but just on the other side, the exact same thing, but just on the other side with a different viewpoint. And that shook me like, whoa, wait. And I think that it is about being really thoughtful about the fact that people's experiences bring them to where they are. And they're doing this the reason they do things is because of their experience and their beliefs. And we have to respect that. And there's this thing, this framework I use when I'm doing conversations, particularly when I'm working with organizations about racial equity, called Courageous Conversations. And the second part of that is speak your truth. And the way that we always frame that is speak your truth because it's valid. It's based on your lens and experience. But the other folks have their truth too, and it's valid based on their lens and experience. And the actual truth is probably somewhere in between.
It goes back to listening too, I'm sure, right? And
that's why I talk about judgment, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to pass judgment and to not use good judgment. Because you're passing judgment. And so, I really have really worked hard on doing that and just making sure that I'm thoughtful about respecting that people have their own views and that you can't be mad at somebody because of where they grew up, how they grew up, what they believe, if it's not the same as yours. You have to try to understand why that is.
Yeah.
To even be able to have a conversation.
It's a question that, like I said, it really hit me when I was reading that post of yours where I was just like, judgment. Oh boy, I've become more judgmental recently. And I didn't think I was. So yeah, that's
the story of my life. I think everybody is. I think it is the undercurrent of behavior in our country that we are all passing a huge amount of judgment about people.
Absolutely.
And the reasons why without really having the full story around the whys.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Can I give you one example, which
absolutely.
I will, and this won't betray anything, but I'm just going to say this, right? I hear folks say, oh my goodness, but there are 72 million people who voted for this one and 70 million people who voted for that one, right? And here's the thing is that we're not a monolith. And the reason that people voted for either one of those folks is not the same.
Yeah.
For even within those groups, I mean.
Yep.
Right. And so because people voted for whomever for different reasons, and most of it's around for something for themselves. It's not about the group. Right. Most of it is because it suits my interests in some way, shape, or form. And that's for everybody. And even within those groups. Yeah. So I just ask people to take a step back and think about, respecting people's lens and experience as they're making their judgments.
As we get to the end of the show, I can't not scratch this itch also. But what's the favorite place you've lived or traveled? Where's the...
Tokyo was my favorite place I lived.
Oh, awesome. How come?
Okay, so it's so funny because from the outside looking in, and even when you go to Japan, the Japanese seem really insular. It feels quite xenophobic, to be honest.
Yeah.
But once you are in it and live it, they are probably the kindest people I've ever experienced in the entire world. And they literally go out of their way for anything. It's amazing. Some of the hospitality, with people that I knew, not necessarily people that you don't, but like when I was living there, I lived there for about 3 years. When I really got to know folks, I got to understand that one of the reasons that Japanese people show up that way is their fear. They're afraid of offending. That's their baseline kind of core. That's the base. So they won't say anything or won't do anything because they're afraid of offending. And they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing because offense is huge in that culture. Offending somebody is the worst thing that you could possibly do. And so if you're a foreigner and they can't speak your language and they're not sure, what's important to you, then they won't say anything and they'll back off because they don't want to offend you. And so once they do know you, however, it is the most brilliant culture. And they are like, they never go anywhere without very ornate gifts. I like that part. They're big on gifts, but it was just and it's a fascinating culture. So I just loved it. It was amazing.
Oh, that's fantastic. So it wouldn't be the CUInsight Experience podcast without some rapid fire questions.
Yay, let's go.
I've mixed in a few new ones this year, but some of the old ones stayed. Do you remember that moment? You had that investment side before, and you and I both kind of came up in that area. But do you remember that moment where you were like, wait a minute, I can make a career out of what I'm doing now? Like that aha, I can do this gig on my own, right? Like,
no, it was not an aha moment. I will say it was never an aha moment. I will say that I always had dreams of being an entrepreneur from the very first day I went to work. I was like, I can't do this. And then 25 years later, I was still saying, well, I'm still here. So I'm not sure that worked out so well for me. And now, like I told you, I'm a slave to my clients. So it's a whole different story. It hasn't changed. It just changed. The dynamics changed a little bit in terms of how the funding model, but that's about it. No, but I think, my aha moment was driven by my family and my kids, frankly.
Okay.
It was, being somebody who was traveling 70% of the time and having 3 children. Yeah. And, coming home, 2 things happened on one trip. One was I was in a hotel room in Hong Kong and woke up and didn't know where I was. Honestly, had no idea where I was. And it freaked me out. And the second thing is when I came home, my youngest child at the time, who was about 3, wouldn't come to me.
Oh boy. Yep.
I was like, oh wait, something's got to give. Yeah. And that was a part of what I was like, I'm moving too much that I don't know where I am. And the fact that my baby is like, I was like, no, this is not it.
It's funny you said you always wanted to be or you always thought you would be an entrepreneur, but then it was 25 years later, right? I don't even know if I've ever told the story on the podcast before, but so out of college, I worked for Morgan Stanley for a decade, and then I was at Franklin Templeton. But like 10 years in, I would stand in the shower, washing my hair going, this is not what I want to be doing at 50 or 60 at all. But I didn't know how to make the switch. And it took another 5 years before, I was out, but it was like that, this isn't it. What is it? So I always, I appreciate your story there. Is there something that you've said no to that you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did?
Probably once a month. And that is clients that I think don't fit me. Yeah. Don't fit. I mean, honestly. And, I'm good at giving referrals, so I'll pass them on to other people. Like if I don't think it's for me, I'll say, but I think here's somebody who you might be able to work with. And, when folks come back to me and tell me stories, I'm like, thank goodness I didn't do that. I was right. I listened to my gut and here I am. But I think that discernment is hugely important. And so I think, discerning, making a choice about something, not based upon money, but because I know that it won't work for me and I have to spend a lot of time with these people is really important.
I love that. What were you like in high school? And do you remember any memorable trouble that you could share with us?
In high school, I was an interesting character. I will say that it's really interesting. I didn't really get into too much trouble because my parents were not joking around. Like I didn't have those kind of parents where trouble was going to happen too much in our house. So I can't say that I got into too much trouble, but I was really smart, but really lazy. I mean, like I didn't want to do my work. I didn't want to do anything, and I kind of like my last 2 years of high school bucked up because I was like, oh, maybe I want to get into college. Maybe I should do something because my parents were like, well, you're going to be, you can get a job when you're 18. That's good. But you have, 12 months and then you got to move out. So I was like, what? I was supposed to go to college. And they're like, you have 12 months to save your money to get your little apartment and move, which you're perfectly welcome to do after you graduate from high school. Or you can buck up and get it together, and then we'll pay for you, we'll help you pay to go to college.
Yeah.
I'll go to college. I'm not ready for that real life thing yet.
No. Please, give me those college years.
They motivated me, but I was lazy as anything. And I don't know how some switch turned at some point, because now I'm probably the other way entirely. I need to sit down. But then I was lazy. Yeah. And I will say this one. When I was in grad school, when I was doing my grad work, I was the person that was most voted to have a dramatically different job within 10 years. And that was when I was in investment banking. They were like, she doesn't belong here. Yeah. Like, she's never going to be here. And so, so I was the person voted that I was the one that they said would have the most dramatically different job within 10 years.
That's fantastic. They could see it. What are you reading? And is there I see a bunch of books behind you. So is there a book that either you've gifted or you just think everybody should read? My
favorite book is right now, it's called Stamped from the Beginning. It's by a guy that everybody will have heard about by now called Ibram Kendi. And he's the one who wrote How Not to Be an Anti-Racist. And that book is okay. But I think Stamped from the Beginning is brilliant, and more because I think that one of the things that we don't get so much is the kind of shared history view of this country, what our real history is as a country and how we got to where we are when we're having these real conversations about this whole racial reckoning thing. And so it's just a treasure trove of information. It's not judgment. It's just like, here's what happened and here's how it happened and here's why, here, these things. And it's just, he's done it beautifully from the perspective of 4 different people, which is really nice. And so I really just like it because I think that it gives a really good grounding and it's interesting. And again, if we talk about understanding each other and how we move beyond where we are, then I think we all have to kind of understand.
I love it. I did my reading list as well, so that's good. I will be ordering that one. The random question. It's not going away. What's the greatest album of all time?
For me, so I had like 5, and I'm thinking like, gosh, like I have like top 5, but I'm not going to give you top 5. You said the greatest. I really love Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life.
That's been mentioned multiple times on the podcast over the years. And I'm a guy who was born and raised in Metro Detroit. So Motown was something I grew up on. But so I like every time I hear Stevie Wonder, I know where that's or Stevie. I'm like, I know where
seriously,
that's going.
Because it's hard to beat. It's hard to
fantastic.
beat because even my kids who are like, now 11 and 15 and 20 something. I don't want to even say his age because I don't want to age myself anymore. But our kids, like, they can even enjoy. And then and I think the timelessness of it is what I love so much is that everybody loves it anytime they hear it, and it's just amazing.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that one. Who's the first person that comes to mind when you hear the word success?
My grandfather.
Oh, you mentioned him earlier. Tell me more. Why your grandfather?
My grandfather was, he was born in like 1920, and he was one of the first maybe Black PhD from Case Western, despite everything and all that. Despite everything that was happening, and it was it was really something. And then he ended up being the first Black prison warden in the United States.
Really?
At the Ohio State Reformatory, and he is the person that started education in the prison systems. No kidding. Oh, wow. So, like, when I think about somebody who made such, and selflessly, really selflessly, when he was in Ohio, and when he would see inmates on the streets, they would come up to him and hug him. He was that kind of guy. Like, it wasn't like, his thing was, this is really about rehabilitation. It's not about, we don't want to make this penal. We don't want people to be here. It's going to be tough. We know that, but we want to rehab people. We don't want to make it so penal that they go out and they're so angry that they cannot be members of society that we want to have. And so he was like, we have to rehabilitate people and give them the tools. We have to ask the why. Why is this person here? What happened that they're here? And we have to solve for that, not, punishing people while they're here so that they're so angry they can't go out and help. And so for me, that kind of impact and being that thoughtful about what reform really should mean is what it is. And when we talk about prison reform, that's what we're trying to get to. It's not about letting people, it's about how do we help people to be able to be better when they're finished with this, if they're finished with it, and so I think that he is for me the pinnacle of success because he literally gave his entire life to that and to impacting other people. And so that's success for me.
That is, wow, that's fantastic. I'm blown away. He probably wouldn't have been happy if you just went and got a job after high school, by the way. So he's probably much happier with your...
You know what? He would have so. And that's the thing, is that no judgment thing definitely comes from him.
Oh, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
Definitely. He was like my idol. And so that definitely comes from him because he never judged. And you couldn't do what he did with people who were in prison if you were judgmental. You couldn't have done that. He didn't judge people for what they did. He was like, how do we make it different for you? How do we make the outcome different? And so he would never have been upset if I decided I was going to get a job after high school. That was me not wanting to work. That had nothing to do with judgment.
Right. What you want to do?
I don't want to work. I don't want to do that.
Go do this college thing instead. That's absolutely beautiful. It's the perfect way to wrap up the show. I thank you again, India, for being on and being our keynote at CUInsight's Lead Mini-Con. The team could not have picked a better person. My last question that I have for you, do you have any asks of our listeners or final thoughts you'd like to share?
I just say, my biggest ask of folks is that, we think about how we're going to make this country different and how each of us show up in that. And so my biggest ask is that we, the judgment thing I talked about, my biggest ask is that we just listen, that we seek to understand, and that at the heart of it, most people are not bad people. They're just moving because of they're moving in a space because of something that they know or believe. And so if you want to understand why, you got to listen to it. You got to listen. And so that's my ask. And that if anybody wants to connect and say hello, I'm on LinkedIn. You can come there. And I also am an avid Clubhouse user for those of you who are on it.
All right.
And so I'm hosting Clubhouse rooms around mostly around corporate stuff. So yeah,
we will link to that for sure, because I'm sure people are going to want to reach out and have more questions. But it will link to that all in the show notes as well. And again, India, thank you so very much. I hope you have a great day, and please stay well, my friend.
Thank you.
Before we go, I would just like to take a moment to say thank you for being you and listening to us today. And once again, a big thank you to India for taking the time to share her experiences with all of us. It was just amazing. And to our sponsors, PSCU. Our friends at PSCU have been a longtime partner and supporter of ours, so please make sure to click on their link in the show notes, give them some love, see everything they have going on to help the credit union community. As I mentioned in the intro, the Mini-Con series, we continue with Change in May. We have another awesome keynote lined up who has worked with companies like Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Forbes. I think we've all heard a few of those, and we're bringing her to the credit union community. Jenny Blake will be giving us a 4-stage framework that we can all use to map out our next moves. So it's going to be amazing. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite players, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. I saw that we're on Amazon now too. Anywhere you can find a podcast, I think you'll be able to find the CUInsight Experience. Thank you all again for listening. Have a great day and be well, friends.